It's always a pleasure to welcome to the show Jillian Melchior from National Review, who's just back from quite a trip, and she wrote some really great stuff on it as well. Jillian, good morning to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for taking time to be on the show. How you feel? Have you readjusted? You're back? You got your body clock back in rhythm?
Still a little bit jet lagged, but doing pretty well. I've got my coffee in hand.
So how, before we get to a lot of the great stuff you wrote over at nationalreview.com, how did this trip come together? How did you figure out where you'd go? How you'd make it to where you were going? What about the logistics of putting something like this together?
Yeah, well, I know in Iraq a lot of people have been very focused on the big picture, but I was really interested in kind of focusing on the small picture because this is such a human story. I mean, the Islamic State isn't just affecting geopolitics. It's driving millions of people out of their homes. The UN had new statistics out about more than 9,000 deaths, more than 17,000 wounded, and a lot of these are Christians and Yazidis. So I really wanted to go over there and interview the people that were being directly impacted by it. So we did a ton of research, looked into what regions Iraqis were deeming safe enough to flee to, and then I went there.
One of those things that you probably didn't think, given that this is what you do for a living, this would have given me a little pause. I would have thought, okay, get me in there and all the logistics and all that. Well, let's talk about getting me out of there.
Well, it was a little bit nerve-wracking, but, we'd prepped well enough, I think, that it was going to be okay.
I love the piece on the old man who slept through ISIS, including the photograph of the guy there. That's just a great story.
Yeah, he was a real character. So I think overwhelmingly the trip was just incredibly depressing. I mean, you're talking to people that their lives have pretty much been ruined. So this guy had become a little bit of a local celebrity because he actually had kind of a happy ending to his story. He was sitting there. He's this old guy. Was speaking to me in a little bit of English and a little bit of Spanish because he loves Fidel Castro. So he was calling me La Mujer. And he's telling me that he had heard that ISIS was about to invade his town. But he poked his head outside, didn't hear gunshots, and decided that it probably wasn't going to happen that night. So he went and took a nap and woke up, walked outside to go do his prayers, and ran face-to-face with an ISIS soldier. They'd already taken over his town. He was the only resident left. Ended up walking down to his watch store, showing them a picture from when he was young. I kind of got the impression that he was a bit of an Iraqi hippie because he had this long hair. But they thought he was an extremist. They didn't really know what to do with him, so they just kind of let him be. He was a little bit freaked out. Hung out for 3 days in his home, and then the Kurdish Peshmerga were able to come in, fight, reclaim the town, and this guy ended up, ending out on the other side of it alive.
Wow.
Jillian Melchior with us, nationalreview.com, is where to find a whole bunch of stories from her trip to Iraq. As you said, you focused on the Christian survivors, those who have been driven from their homes, those who fear returning home. You went to some areas where they had deemed it safe enough to be, but if current conditions hold, that might not be true for a lengthy amount of time. What is life like for them now? What do they think it will be like perhaps 6 months, 1 year from now?
Boy, it's not good. It was pretty overwhelming, to be honest. I mean, you see people who are living in tents, sleeping under bridges, living in structures that haven't been fully finished or fully built yet. And these are the ones that have been lucky enough to survive. So they're literally living hand to mouth, relying on international aid, charity to feed them and their families. And one of the things that I heard really commonly was they're very anxious because they know a cold winter is coming, and they don't even have coats. Like, a lot of them fled barefoot. So just the amount of emotional anxiety that they're experiencing is very high. Now, their faith is very strong. If you talk to them, they say they're praying every day. I attended a church service, and it was so packed you couldn't even get in the door. People are actually standing outside on the patio. But at the same time, there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of uncertainty about the future, and just a general sense of hopelessness. I think I met 3 people who wanted to stay in Iraq. The rest of them said there's no future there.
These Christians have been faithful to their faith. They've chosen their faith over their comfort. They've chosen their faith over their home. They've chosen their faith over conversion. And yet there has to be some level, I would imagine, of second guessing of why is this happening? How long can we survive? What is that crisis of faith, perhaps, for some that you talk to?
Yeah, well, I think one of the most interesting interviews I did was with this priest. He'd been in Baghdad before. He'd survived being shot, being kidnapped. He'd had his church blown up before. So he is definitely a man where persecution isn't strange to him. And he was really interesting to talk to because he said people come to him a lot with questions about their faith. Just because they have this really strong faith doesn't mean that doubt's not present. And he tries to emphasize to them that this isn't something that God did to you. It's something that politics did. It's something that evil human beings are doing, but it's not something that God's doing to you. By the same token, I asked him if he believed that God was in control, and he said he wouldn't answer the question, really. He said, that's an interesting question. Write that down. So, but I overwhelmingly heard from people that they pray a lot and that they want the West and they want Americans to pray for them, too.
And yeah, that leads me to what I was going to ask you next is, what is it that you hear that they would like from us?
Well, I think prayer is definitely a big thing that Christians want in particular. A lot of them want to be able to immigrate to the United States or to Britain or to Australia, to a place where they can have a future with their family. And if they don't get that, a lot of them want to be, in a house with doors. They want a coat. They want food for their children. And they really want stability. Now, on a military level, I met with this high-ranking Peshmerga Kurdish commander. He said that he thinks airstrikes are enough for them to basically hold the line against ISIS as it is right now, maybe force some very small advances against ISIS. But he doesn't think it's enough for Iraq as a whole. He thinks there really need to be international troops, American boots on the ground, to supplement the airstrikes.
Jillian Melchior with us from National Review, nationalreview.com. She's just back from 2 weeks in Iraq. It's Riley and Scott here on WROK. You have a piece, Escape from Mount Sinjar. And this is the story that we heard a lot about here, the Christians surrounded by ISIS troops, the airlifts out, the aid drops into the area. What more can you tell us about what this situation was like for those Christians on Mount Sinjar?
Well, it wasn't Christians. It was the Yazidis,
right.
And they're a very ancient religion, very peaceful religion. But, they endured this really horrific experience on Mount Sinjar, and I think that got a lot of media attention. But what people don't realize is that just because they were rescued from Mount Sinjar doesn't mean that their ordeal is over. So I think one of the most difficult things I saw while I was over there was this little girl named Claudia. She was not even 4 years old yet. She had this really wild hair, these kind of dark, angry eyes, and she was just dead silent. She wasn't acting like a normal kid at all. And then I started talking with her dad, just this really sweet guy. He's got a heart tattoo on his arm with his wife's name on it. And he was saying that when his daughter Claudia talks to him now, she wants to know when ISIS is going to come back and finish killing them, because she's seen enough people die around her. She's seen this really traumatic thing happen to her people, and she's living in fear. So I think she's one of the ones who escaped. On the flip side, you've got about 500 men who we know ISIS killed. Some of them were buried alive, some of them beheaded. And then you've got more than 1,000 women who right now are in ISIS captivity being used as sex slaves. And it's really terrible. I mean, I spoke to a woman who managed to escape from them, and her stories about what she'd endured was just, it makes your blood run cold.
And, when you talk about the escape and where they wind up now, ISIS is not breathing down their neck, but where they wind up as refugees, dirt floor and very little else going for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really want to emphasize, they don't feel like they have a future. They feel like ISIS is on their doorstep. They already know what it's capable of. There's no guarantee of safety. There's no guarantee of stability, and they don't really believe that things are going to get better.
Jillian Melchior with us here from National Review, nationalreview.com. It's Riley and Scott on WROK. The Yazidis, the Kurds, Iraqis in general have lived through an incredible amount of war, violence over the past 30 years or so. And now ISIS. We hear from our leaders here that it's unlike anything. Chuck Hagel, it's unlike anything we've ever dealt with before, the ISIS terrorists. What terms do the Iraqis use to describe ISIS? How do they describe what they're dealing with ISIS now, trying to move through Iraq?
Well, a lot of them said that they're monsters, that they're not even human, that they can't imagine humans doing this to another person. And this is, like you said, a culture where, for a lot of generations, being a refugee is a universal experience. They're not strangers to violence, and they're overwhelmed by what they've seen. I mean, one of the things that was another difficult interview to get through is with this guy. He's back from the front lines. He's volunteered to fight for his country. Young guy, a father. And he was saying that he's just really terrified. Like, he was pretty rattled because they're putting all this propaganda online. He's watched them behead people online. He's watched what they do to the bodies. And he's just horrified. And he knows he's going to be up against them pretty quick here again. So I definitely think it's not only the violence, it's the emotional and the psychological impacts that they're having on the people. And it's resulted in just complete and utter hopelessness.
You know, people here kind of wonder about the president's or the administration's resolve, how far willing to go to put a stop to ISIS, to curb, contain, all that. How do the people on the ground there feel about our resolve?
Well, in Kurdistan, I think they're very grateful for the help that they have received. I mean, the airstrikes have made somewhat of a difference. But that said, for Iraq as a whole, what I'm hearing is that they don't believe they can push ISIS back. They don't believe that they can wipe them out without boots on the ground. And I think the United States bailed on this early. We left out of political motivations. We weren't thinking about military considerations. We weren't thinking about what was best for the Iraqi people when we left. So I definitely think there's reason for them to doubt our resolve.
Jillian Melchior with us here for another minute or two. It's Riley and Scott on WROK. Yet in the midst of all of this, life goes on. And I heard you tell a story on Fox Business Network about a youngster who had decided he was going to be an entrepreneur, starting a clothing store, clothing business, so to speak.
Yeah, I just love this kid. He's 18 years old. He's a Syrian refugee living in Iraq now. And he lives in a tent, but this kid managed to borrow some money from his big brother and started up this clothing store in a refugee camp. And he's actually doing pretty well. I mean, he goes into town once a week, buys what he thinks other refugees will need, and has this great little store going. And actually, the woman who was giving me a guide she was my guide for that Syrian refugee camp trip. She was a young woman. She'd met her husband there. She just got married a week before. So life does go on. It's hard, but you got to admire the resolve of these people and their courage, and their faith, even though they're going through something so difficult.
Jillian Melchior with us from National Review, nationalreview.com. Did you ask how they felt life was going post U.S. invasion, but pre-ISIS? So that really, I guess, when you look at it, brief period of time before ISIS started to try to run through the country, but after there was some level of stability following the U.S. presence in the country. Did they talk about what life was like during that period?
You know, that's a really difficult question to pin down because what happens in Iraq is so regionally specific. Like, one part of it can be relatively stable, like the part I was in, even in a time of war, and other parts are just hell on earth. So I think one of the men I talked to, he's a Christian named Evan. He's 30 years old, newlywed, and he said that in his entire life, 30 years, he can't remember a single time where he's felt peace or safety, that for him it's just overwhelmingly been bad, and that he expects it to get worse.
All right. Well, you guys catch up if you have not read what Jillian's written about her trip over there. Absolutely fantastic stuff. But, we've come to expect that from you and everything you write, Jillian. Thanks for taking time out of your day to spend with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Have a great weekend.